Most organizations think governance is documentation. They are wrong. Documentation is what you write down after the platform has already decided what it will allow. Governance is control, enforced intent at scale. Because once you have dozens of teams and hundreds of subscriptions, your blast radius stops being a bad deployment and starts being a bad operating model. That's when audits turn into emergencies, costs leak quietly for months, and security becomes a collection of exceptions nobody owns. This episode isn't an Azure features tour. It's the operating system, landing zones, management groups, RBAC with PIM, Azure policy as real guardrails, and the feedback loops that keep it from degrading. The enterprise failure mode, policy drift, becomes normal. Here's what most enterprises don't admit out loud. Governance doesn't usually fail because controls are missing. It fails because controls drift. It starts clean. There's a baseline. There's a naming standard. There's a policy initiative. There are owner assignments that are temporary. There's a spreadsheet somebody calls a RAC. Everyone feels responsible. Then the first exception request shows up. It's always reasonable. It's always urgent. It's always just for this one workload. The platform team makes a choice. Block the business and be hated, or approve the exception and be pragmatic. They approve it because humans optimize for reducing conflict in the moment. That exception becomes an entropy generator, and the enterprise mistake is thinking entropy generators are self-cleaning. They aren't. Most organizations never remove exceptions. They don't even track them properly. They just accumulate them until the baseline is no longer the baseline. It's a loose suggestion with historical artifacts attached. Now, there are three distinct failure types that get conflated as we need better governance. First, missing controls. That's simple. You never created the guardrail. You never assigned the initiative. You never enabled logging. You never restricted regions. This is immature, but honest. You can fix it by building the control. Second, drifting controls. This is the real enterprise disease. You had the guardrail, but you allowed incremental deviations until the guardrail no longer defines reality. In other words, the policy exists, but the organization has learned how to root around it. Third, conflicting controls. This is where multiple teams create their own baselines, each correct in isolation, but incompatible in combination. One team denies public endpoints, another team deploys managed services that assume public endpoints during provisioning, a third team builds a pipeline that auto-remediates tags but breaks Terraform state. Everyone is doing governance. The platform is doing conditional chaos. That distinction matters because enterprises treat all three as a tooling problem. They buy something, they deploy dashboards, they measure compliance scores, they create more documentation. And none of it stops drift because drift is not a knowledge problem, it's a decision distribution problem. In Azure, decision-making is inherently distributed. ARM will accept deployments from portals, pipelines, service principals, managed identities, and whatever else you allowed into the tenant. Every team makes thousands of micro-decisions. Regions, SKUs, network exposure, identity assignments, logging, encryption, tags. If you don't enforce constraints, you don't have governance, you have opinions. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Even good teams create chaos at scale because good doesn't survive unbounded choice. People rotate, projects get handed over, contractors show up, deadlines compress, teams optimize locally. Over time, the platform becomes a museum of half-enforced intentions. This is why the platform team becomes a ticket queue. Not because they're incompetent, because the system is asking them to be the runtime authorization engine for the entire enterprise. Every exception is a manual compile step. Every quick approval is a new branch of behavior that someone must remember forever. Then audit season arrives, and suddenly the organization discovers it can't prove what it thinks it enforces. The spreadsheet says public access is blocked, but the tenant contains a set of exemptions nobody can explain. Secure score looks fine, but only because the loudest issues were muted through waivers. Logging exists, but not consistently because deploy, if not exists, was never remediated for legacy resources. Costs can't be allocated because tags were recommended, not required. So the audit becomes a scramble. Export policies, screenshot dashboards, manually map controls, and hope the auditor doesn't ask the one question that exposes the drift. Incidents are worse. When something goes wrong, the post-incident review doesn't say we lacked policy. It says we didn't realize this path existed. That path exists because drift created it. An owner assignment that never expired, a subscription moved into a different management group, an exemption without an end date, a resource type allowed temporarily, and now the blast radius is real. This is where most enterprises break things. They confuse autonomy with absence of constraints. Autonomy only scales when boundaries are explicit and enforced. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. Exceptions are not special cases. They are permanent forks in system behavior unless you design them to expire. And that's why the only sustainable fix is governance by design. Not more meetings, not more documentation. Design, governance by design, deterministic guardrails versus probabilistic security. Governance by design means the platform enforces intent, not people. It stops being a set of guidelines and becomes a machine that compiles your enterprise assumptions into a loud reality. In architectural terms, Azure Governance is an authorization and compliance compiler sitting on top of Azure Resource Manager. ARM is the control plane. Everything becomes a request. Create, update, delete. The only question that matters is what the control plane will accept. Most organizations treat that acceptance as a human process. Tickets, reviews, approvals, tribal knowledge. That's the comfortable model. And it doesn't scale. The alternative is a deterministic model. What must be true for the resource to exist at all? Deterministic doesn't mean perfect. It means predictable. It means the same request gets the same outcome every time, regardless of who clicked the button, which pipeline ran, or which team is under pressure this week. That is the foundational difference between governance and governance theater. A deterministic guardrail is something like resources can only exist in approved regions, storage accounts must use secure transfer, diagnostics must go to a known workspace, public endpoints are denied unless explicitly allowed through a controlled path. If the condition isn't met, the deployment fails. Not later, not after a report, at the boundary. Now contrast that with the probabilistic model most enterprises drift into. Probabilistic security is the world of should be true unless its audit only controls recommended tags, optional encryption, and a policy baseline with exemptions sprinkled everywhere because delivery pressure always wins eventually. In a probabilistic system, security becomes a set of odds. Most resources comply. Most teams do the right thing. Most of the time, nothing bad happens. That's not governance. That's wishful thinking with a dashboard. And here's the trap. Probabilistic systems feel productive. They don't block anyone. They don't cause deployment failures. They minimize friction. But friction doesn't disappear. It moves. It moves into incident response, audit preparation, and cost cleanup. It becomes delayed pain with interest. The enterprise goal isn't to centralize control. It's to enable autonomy without turning the platform team into a permanent approval board. Governance by design is how that happens. You define the minimum non-negotiables, you enforce them automatically, and you let teams innovate inside the box. This is where most architects make the wrong trade-off. They think enforcing guardrails kills velocity. What kills velocity is inconsistency. Every team reinventing patterns, every deployment producing a new variant, every exception becoming a bespoke snowflake that breaks the next automation. The weird part is the platform doesn't care about your org chart. ARM doesn't know what a critical workload is. It doesn't know what temporary means. It doesn't know that a contractor is deploying something you'll inherit for 5 years. It just evaluates requests against the rules you actually implemented. So the design question becomes, what must always be true and at what scope? Because scope is where determinism is won or lost. If you enforce guardrails at the wrong level, you get either chaos or gridlock. Too high, and you block legitimate variation. Too low, and you create drift because every team creates its own version of policy. This is why governance starts with structure, a hierarchy that matches intent, and guardrails attached to that hierarchy, so inheritance does real work. And there's one more uncomfortable truth. A deterministic model requires you to say no in advance, in code, before the request arrives. That means leaders must sponsor it, not approve it emotionally, sponsor it operationally. Because the first time a deployment fails in production due to a deny policy, somebody will call it a governance outage. They will demand an exception. And if leadership treats exceptions as negotiation instead of risk decisions, you're back to probabilistic security within a month. So governance by design is not a policy project. It's an operating stance. Define the boundaries, enforce them centrally, and make deviations expensive enough that teams only ask when the risk is real. Now, the obvious question is where to start. You start with the foundation that makes inheritance and boundaries possible at scale. Enterprise landing zones and management groups. Landing zones and management groups where scale either works or doesn't. An enterprise landing zone is not a template you deploy and forget. It's the set of prerequisites that make every future workload boring. Identity boundaries, network boundaries, logging destinations, policy inheritance, and ownership models already in place before the first team shows up with a deadline. Most orgs do this backwards. They migrate the workload, then they ask the platform team to govern it. That's like building a city, then arguing about roads and water after people moved in. The platform will accept the chaos. The auditors will not. Landing zones are the pre-work that makes autonomy possible. They standardize what must be standardized, and they leave everything else to the workload teams. The hierarchy is the enforcement surface. And if you get the hierarchy wrong, every control becomes expensive. At the top is the tenant root group. Under that are management groups. Under management groups are subscriptions. Under subscriptions are resource groups. Under resource groups are the resources. That chain matters because inheritance matters. Azure policy inherits down that tree. RBAC inherits down that tree. If your tree is messy, your governance becomes ClickOps archaeology. This is where people get cute. They create management group hierarchies that look like org charts. Region, business unit, environment, application, team, project, fiscal year, the moon phase. It feels structured. It's also unmanageable. A management group hierarchy should be shallow enough that humans can reason about it during an incident. 3 to 4 levels is usually the practical ceiling, not because Microsoft says so, because every additional level becomes another place for conflicting policy assignments, RBAC sprawl. And why does this subscription inherit that deny policy? Depth creates ambiguity. Breadth creates delegation. You want breadth. The governing principle is simple: separate by intent. Platform intent, shared services and foundational components that should be tightly controlled. Workload intent, applications that need freedom inside guardrails. Sandbox intent, experimentation, where you accept risk, but you contain it. Production intent, workloads that must meet the baseline with tight exception handling. Regulated intent, data boundaries where you're not negotiating encryption, logging, or exposure. Those are boundary decisions. And boundary decisions are how you avoid pretending a single tenant is one uniform risk domain. This is also why management group design is not an Azure feature. It's how you encode your enterprise risk model into the control plane. A common pattern that survives reality is a top-level split between platform and workloads. Platform gets its own management group for identity, network, security tooling, and logging. It typically hosts subscriptions for shared services, hub networking, central monitoring, identity-related services, and anything that should not be modified by app teams. Workloads sit under their own management groups, segmented by environment and risk. Production and non-production should not share inheritance unless you enjoy explaining why dev deployments can bypass guardrails that prod must obey. Then you isolate sandboxes, not to punish teams, to contain novelty. Sandboxes are where teams learn, prototype, and break things. The enterprise just refuses to let those breaks propagate into regulated or production boundaries. Now here's the part most people miss. A landing zone is not only structure. It's a contract. If a subscription lives in this management group, it inherits these policies, these role assignments, and these logging requirements. That contract is what makes subscription vending and self-service possible later. Without that contract, every new subscription becomes a bespoke negotiation. You lose the ability to scale. And once you have that contract, you can keep the hierarchy understandable by avoiding ornamental layers. If a management group level doesn't change policy, RBAC, or logging posture, it's probably just decoration. Decoration becomes entropy. So the objective is a hierarchy where moving a subscription is a meaningful action. It changes the rules. It changes the blast radius. It changes who can do what. That's how you know your structure is doing real work. In the next section, the conversation gets even more uncomfortable, because subscriptions are where governance becomes expensive if you pretend they're only billing containers. They are not. They are your primary boundary for cost, access, policy inheritance, and incident containment. Subscription strategy, billing boundary, security boundary, blast radius boundary. Subscriptions are not where you put workloads. They are where you draw boundaries the enterprise can actually enforce. Billing boundary is the obvious one. One subscription, one cost container you can budget, alert, and attribute. But if you stop there, you'll build a tenant that looks tidy in finance reports and chaotic everywhere else. Because subscriptions are also security boundaries. They are the scope where RBAC assignments become survivable, where policy inheritance becomes predictable, and where incidents become containable. When something goes wrong, you want the failure domain to be a subscription, not the entire tenant, because everyone is contributor at root. This is a boundary decision, and boundary decisions are how you keep blast radius from turning into organizational trauma. Start with the principle: group subscriptions under management groups based on shared governance needs, not based on org charts. If two subscriptions need different deny policies, different logging destinations, different network models, or different access patterns, they should not share the same inheritance surface. Every time you pretend they're the same, you create policy exceptions later. Those exceptions become permanent forks. A common enterprise pattern that works is environment separation: dev, test, and prod in separate subscriptions. Not because Microsoft requires it, because it gives you 3 useful properties: different access, different policy strictness, and different incident containment. Dev can tolerate broader experimentation, prod cannot. And when you put them together, you inevitably drift prod down to dev behavior through temporary waivers. Another pattern is business unit separation, but only when business units are truly autonomous and need isolation. If business units share platform services and security posture, splitting subscriptions per business unit can create redundant work and inconsistent standards. Separation is not automatically governance. It's just multiplication. Use it only when it reduces risk or clarifies ownership. Regulated workloads are the clearest case. If a workload has data residency constraints, higher audit requirements, or strict network exposure rules, it needs an isolated subscription boundary. Otherwise, the regulated baseline becomes optional because it competes with non-regulated delivery pressure in the same inheritance tree. Now, the anti-patterns, they are painfully common. First, one subscription for everything. This feels efficient until the first time you try to delegate. Then you either grant broad rights to unblock teams, or you centralize everything through tickets. Either way, you lose. One big subscription becomes a shared blast radius and a shared blame domain. Second, random per-team subscriptions with no inheritance strategy. Teams get autonomy, but the enterprise gets entropy. Policies are inconsistent, RBAC differs per team, logging ends up in multiple workspaces, and your SOC spends its time correlating across fractured telemetry. This is how you end up with cloud sprawl and no credible compliance story. Third, subscriptions created ad hoc with no subscription vending model. If a subscription is born through a portal click, it will inherit whatever defaults happened to exist that day, and those defaults change. That means your governance baseline becomes a matter of timing, not intent. That's an unacceptable property in an enterprise system. A proper subscription strategy answers 4 questions up front. Who owns this subscription? Not who pays for it. Who is accountable for what exists inside it? What baseline applies? Which initiatives are assigned? Which denies are non-negotiable? Which controls are audit first? What access model applies? Which groups get contributor? Which groups are eligible for elevation? And which roles are forbidden? And what is the blast radius expectation? If this subscription is compromised or misconfigured, what is the maximum damage it can do by design? If you can't answer those, don't create the subscription yet. You're not creating capacity, you're creating future incident scope. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Subscriptions are where enterprises try to avoid saying no, and then they pay for it later. They create a shared subscription because it's easier today. Then they spend years untangling access policies and billing allocations. The platform didn't become complicated, the boundary choices did. Once you have the subscription boundaries aligned to intent, the next entropy source is access. Because even with perfect hierarchy, one careless owner assignment can punch through all your design assumptions. Identity and RBAC, stop assigning people, start assigning intent. Once subscription boundaries exist, identity becomes the fastest way to destroy them. Azure RBAC is simple on paper: who can do what where. Principal, role, scope. In reality, it becomes an authorization graph that quietly sprawls until nobody can tell you why an intern can delete a production firewall. The foundational mistake is treating RBAC as HR, assigning access to named humans because it's fast. Humans are not stable. Teams change, vendors rotate, people go on leave, and accounts get compromised. If your governance model depends on individuals being careful forever, you've already lost. RBAC needs to express intent, not personalities. Intent is stable. Workload operators can restart resources. Platform engineers can manage network. Security can read posture. Automation can deploy but not assign roles. Those are durable statements. So the enterprise law is this: assign roles to groups, not users. Not because it's fashionable, because it's the only way offboarding works at scale. If a person leaves and you have to search for their direct assignments across subscriptions, you've built a breach persistence mechanism. Group membership is the control surface. The identity platform already knows how to manage groups. Your job is to make group design match boundary design. That means you don't create one group called Azure admins and call it governance. You create groups that encode scope and purpose. Not elegant names, useful names. A group should imply exactly where it has access and why. And then there's scope discipline. Most people think scope is about convenience. It's about blast radius. Azure gives you scopes in descending order of danger. Management group, subscription, resource group, resource. The higher you assign, the more inheritance you create. Inheritance is powerful, and it is also how privilege spreads when nobody is paying attention. The rule is assign at the highest scope that meets the requirement but no higher. That sounds contradictory until you understand the goal. You want minimal assignments, but you want minimal blast radius. If a team truly owns a subscription, then assign at subscription scope. If they own one application, assign at that resource group. If they only need access to one key vault, do not give them contributor at the resource group because you're tired. This is also where people misuse contributor. Contributor is not developer. Contributor can change almost everything. If your developers can change network, identity-related resources, policy assignments, or logging configuration, you've given them the ability to erase the guardrails that made them safe. And owner is worse. Owner is not a convenience role. Owner is a breach multiplier because it includes the ability to assign roles. When an identity is compromised, owner turns that compromise into persistence. Attackers don't just deploy resources, they grant themselves access that survives password resets. Microsoft guidance in least privilege patterns commonly advises keeping subscription owners extremely limited. In practice, the right number is as few as you can operate with, and it should be monitored like a toxic asset. Now, the part most enterprises avoid because it creates conflict, separating duties. A platform team should not be the same identity cohort as workload operators. Security readers should not also be deployment writers. Auditors should not be troubleshooters with contributor. When you combine duties, you don't just increase risk, you erase accountability. Every incident becomes someone with broad access did something and you can't prove intent. So define the roles as intent lanes. Platform lane manages shared services, network, identity integrations, logging destinations, rarely touches workload resources. Workload lane deploys and operates applications inside the subscription boundary, but cannot rewrite the boundary. Security lane reads posture, reads logs, can request elevation for investigations, but does not own production mutations by default. Automation lane, service principals, and managed identities that deploy the approved patterns, and nothing else. If you do this right, RBAC stops being an access spreadsheet and becomes a boundary enforcement tool. Teams can move faster because they know what they're allowed to do without asking. The platform team stops being a permission desk because permissions express design, but RBAC still degrades over time because standing privilege accumulates. People get temporary access and never lose it. Emergency fixes become permanent roles, and eventually, least privilege becomes a slogan. That's why RBAC alone is not enough. You need time-bound elevation as the default behavior, and that means privileged identity management. Privileged identity management. Standing privilege is just deferred incident response. Most enterprises say they believe in least privilege. Then they hand out permanent admin rights because people need to do their jobs. That isn't least privilege, that's pre-approved incident response. Standing privilege is just risk you haven't been forced to pay for yet. PM exists because RBAC assignments rot. They rot for the same reason everything else does. Humans don't come back later to remove access they no longer need. The urgent work finishes, the ticket closes, and the elevated role quietly becomes part of someone's identity for years. And in Azure, that's not a small mistake. A single persistent owner or user access administrator assignment is a persistence mechanism for attackers, a compliance finding waiting to happen, and a guaranteed we didn't know they still had that moment during an incident review. Privileged identity management flips the model. It separates entitlement from activation. Eligible means the identity is allowed to request elevation. Active means it is elevated right now. That distinction matters because it turns privileged access from a default state into an event. Events can be audited, events can be constrained, events can expire. In other words, PM makes privilege behave like a controlled resource instead of a personal benefit. Here's the rule of thumb. If someone's job requires admin rights all day, every day, the job is poorly designed. Admin is not a job function. It's an escalation path. So the operating model becomes everyone runs as normal RBAC roles most of the time, and the few actions that require high privilege are done through time-bound activation with friction that forces intent. And yes, the friction is the point. That friction is where most organizations break things, because leaders treat it like a negotiation with developers instead of a safety mechanism for the enterprise. PM only works when leadership mandates it as a standard, not when a platform team tries to encourage it. The first week you enforce it, someone will complain that approvals slow them down. They will ask for permanent access just for this project. If that request succeeds, you don't have PM, you have a bypass process, so you need a few non-negotiables. First, time limits. Privileged roles expire. Always. There's no such thing as until further notice. If you can't set an end time, you are approving a permanent exception, and we already covered how that ends. Second, justification, not a paragraph of theater. A real reason tied to a task, a ticket, a change request, an incident. If the request can't name what it's doing, it shouldn't be elevated. Third, MFA. Privileged activation without strong authentication is just convenience layered on top of risk. Fourth, approvals for the roles that can change boundaries. Some roles should be self-activate for operational speed. Others should require a second set of eyes because they can rewrite the system. And the system-defining roles are predictable. Owner and user access administrator. Anything that can assign roles or change permissions is not an operational role. It's a governance role. Treat it like one. Now, eligible versus active is only the mechanics. The real design is separation of duties. Platform owners are the people who define and maintain the guardrails, policy assignments, management, group structure, subscription vending, logging destinations, network baselines. Workload operators run applications inside those boundaries. Deploy, scale, patch, troubleshoot. Auditors and security teams need visibility and evidence, read access, compliance posture, logs, and the ability to request temporary elevation for investigations. When you blur those roles, PIM becomes cosmetic. People just activate everything because they might need it, and the enterprise ends up with privileged concurrency, dozens of admins active all day, every day, with justifications that say, work. That's not governance, that's paperwork around power. A good PIM model keeps the eligible set small and the active set smaller. It makes privilege the exception, not the default. It also makes emergency access explicit. Break glass accounts are not daily drivers, and their use should be loud, logged, and reviewed. And here's the part that makes it survivable. Pair PIM with boundaries. If you've designed subscriptions and management groups as real blast radius containers, then PIM activation has a meaningful scope. Someone can be eligible for contributor in a specific production subscription, not across everything. That keeps incident impact bounded even when elevation happens. So PIM is not extra security. It's the enforcement mechanism that keeps RBAC from collapsing into permanent admin culture. Access controls decide who can do what, but they don't decide what is allowed to exist. That's the next layer, Azure policy. Azure policy system, resource state enforcement, not guidance. Azure policy is where most enterprises reveal what they actually believe. Because RBAC controls who can act. Policy controls what is allowed to exist, and policy does not care who you are. It doesn't care that you're a global admin having a bad day. It doesn't care that the deployment came from a trusted pipeline. It evaluates the resource state and decides whether ARM will accept it. That distinction matters. Most organizations treat policy like guardrails on a bowling lane, helpful suggestions that stop beginners from throwing the ball into the gutter. That is the wrong mental model. Azure policy is a gate in the control plane, a resource state gate. It sits in the deployment path and says this request is valid or it is not. If you want deterministic governance, policy is how you get it, not by writing standards documents and hoping people remember them. Now, structurally, Azure policy is three things: definitions, initiatives, and assignments. Definitions are the individual rules, what to check and what to do when the check fails. Initiatives are bundles of definitions, your baseline packaged into something you can apply repeatedly. Assignments are where you attach a definition or initiative to a scope in your hierarchy. Management group, subscription, resource group, sometimes a resource. And that scope part is the entire game. If you assign policies at the wrong scope, you create drift. If you assign them too narrowly, every subscription becomes a snowflake. If you assign them too broadly without thinking, you block legitimate variation and create an exception culture. So the enterprise pattern is define baselines centrally, assign them high enough that inheritance does the work, and only allow deviations through controlled exception paths. Now, the part people get wrong, the effect model. Azure policy isn't one thing. It's a set of enforcement behaviors. The important ones for enterprise design are deny, audit, modify, and deploy if not exists. Deny is the obvious one. Deny means the resource can't be created or updated if it violates the rule. This is preventive control. It's deterministic. It stops drift at the boundary. Audit is the other common one. Audit records non-compliance but lets the deployment happen. This is a detective control. It's useful during rollout and discovery, but it's not a guardrail. Audit doesn't prevent anything. It just produces evidence that something happened. Modify is where policy starts behaving like a compiler. Modify can change a deployment or resource configuration to meet your rule, add tags, enforce settings, normalize configurations. This reduces friction because teams don't have to remember everything, but it also creates hidden behavior if you don't communicate it clearly. Deploy if not exists is the most powerful and the most abused. It says, if a required configuration or related resource is missing, deploy it automatically. This is how you enforce diagnostics, monitoring agents, security extensions, and every resource must send logs to the right place. It's also how you end up with remediation tasks you never ran, and therefore a tenant full of legacy resources that never got fixed. Here's the rule of thumb most enterprises need and rarely follow. Use deny for boundaries. You are not negotiating. Regions, disallowed resource types, prohibited exposure patterns, and this must never exist in this environment. Use audit for learning and rollout, not as a destination. If something matters, it eventually becomes deny, modify, or deploy if not exists. Use modify for hygiene, tags, standard settings, consistency that should be automatic. Use deploy if not exists for platform requirements that must be present for governance to function. Diagnostics, log destinations, baseline monitoring, and security controls that are systemic. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. If you deploy policies but don't remediate existing resources, you're running a split-brain environment. New resources follow the rules. Old resources don't. That's not governance. That's two realities in one tenant. Now, initiatives. Initiatives are how you stop reinventing baselines. You don't want 50 separate policy assignments per subscription. You want a few standardized baselines, versioned, repeatable, and assigned consistently. This is where enterprises break things again. They create too many initiatives, each owned by a different team, each overlapping, each slightly different. Then they spend their lives managing exemptions and conflicts. The better model is boring. A small number of enterprise initiatives aligned to intent. One baseline for production, one baseline for non-production, one baseline for regulated, one baseline for platform. If you need more than that, the hierarchy is probably wrong, or your baseline is trying to encode every opinion the company has ever had. And yes, you will still need exceptions. Exemptions are necessary. Legacy exists. Migrations exist. Some services have awkward provisioning paths. Some workloads have real constraints. But exemptions are also entropy generators, and they must be treated like radioactive material. Documented, time-bound, and reviewed. There are two kinds of exceptions that matter. A waiver is, we are non-compliant, we accept the risk temporarily. That must have an expiry, an owner, and a reason that an auditor could read without laughing. A mitigated exception is, we are deviating, but we have compensating controls. That still needs ownership and review because mitigations decay too. The minute the mitigation disappears, you're just non-compliant with extra confidence. And here's the quiet failure. Deleting or changing policy assignments can orphan exemptions, leaving behind compliance gaps nobody sees unless they actively hunt them. That's not a tooling issue. That's a life cycle issue. Policy needs the same discipline as code: versioning, change control, and cleanup. Now, the practical part, the first guardrails that pay rent. Enterprises don't need 500 policies on day one. They need 10 to 15 that prevent obvious damage. Require tags that enable ownership and cost allocation. Enforce allowed locations to avoid sovereignty and latency surprises. Restrict unapproved SKUs and resource types so teams can't accidentally deploy a billing incident. Require encryption and secure transfer where applicable. Enforce diagnostics so logs exist where your SOC expects them. Deny public endpoints in production unless explicitly routed through an approved design. These are boundary decisions implemented as deterministic controls. And when teams complain, the response isn't "we're doing governance." The response is the platform only allows safe autonomy. Now, once policy is working as the gate, you still need feedback, because even a perfect policy baseline doesn't tell you where you're weak. It tells you where you're violated. That's the difference between enforcement and posture. And that's where Defender for Cloud and continuous compliance signals enter the picture. Security posture and continuous compliance, signals, not dashboards. Defender for Cloud is not governance, it's the smoke alarm. And like every smoke alarm, it's only useful if you wired it into a building that can actually contain a fire. Most enterprises treat Defender for Cloud like a report card. They chase Secure Score because it's measurable, it looks good in steering committees, and it creates the illusion that security is improving. That's the wrong use. Secure Score is a prioritization signal. It's a backlog generator. It's the system pointing at the most common and most impactful misconfigurations it can see. If you treat it like a trophy, you will do what enterprises always do. Optimize the number instead of the risk. You'll disable recommendations you don't want to explain. You'll accept waivers because they're politically convenient. And eventually the score becomes managed while the attack surface stays real. Here's the rule of thumb. Governance is what prevents unsafe states. Posture management is how you detect the states that slip through, the states you haven't governed yet, and the toxic combinations you didn't anticipate. This is where CSPM earns its keep. Not because it shows you a dashboard, because it surfaces attack paths, it surfaces exposure patterns, it surfaces the uncomfortable adjacency, public endpoint, plus weak identity, plus missing logs. The platform doesn't fail because one control is missing. It fails because several minor gaps line up. Defender for Cloud is useful when it changes what you fix next. That means the operating model must treat it as a feed, a continuous set of signals that either map back to policy gaps, RBAC gaps, or operating discipline gaps. If Defender tells you storage accounts allow public access, the outcome shouldn't be, "we'll tell teams to be careful." The outcome should be a decision. Should this be denied by policy in production, modified automatically, or permitted only through a controlled exception path? If Defender tells you you're missing diagnostics, the outcome is not a ticket storm. The outcome is deploy. If not exists, plus remediation tasks, wired into subscription vending so new subscriptions inherit the logging baseline from day zero. If Defender tells you identities are overprivileged, the outcome is not an annual access review PowerPoint. The outcome is tightening scopes, reducing owners, pushing privilege into PM, and monitoring activation events like production changes. This is the feedback loop. Signals should end as enforced guardrails, or they remain noise. Now, compliance. Most enterprises think compliance is an audit artifact, a spreadsheet you fill in, a set of controls you map once a year, and a fire drill where everyone produces screenshots. That model fails in cloud because cloud changes every day. So the only compliance model that survives is continuous compliance, the ability to show at any point what is enforced, what is compliant, what is exempted, and who approved the deviations. This is where Compliance Manager is useful, but again, not as a tool tour. Compliance Manager matters because it forces traceability. It takes requirements from frameworks and turns them into accessible items, improvement actions, evidence, and progress. It gives you a place to link your "we enforce this" claim to something real. Policy initiatives, logging standards, access controls, and operational processes. But the critical part isn't the UI. The critical part is the mapping philosophy. You don't start with HIPAA or PCI and then go hunting for Azure features. You start with your enforced baselines and map them to frameworks through control families. Many organizations use a common pivot, like NIST-style control domains, to reduce duplication across frameworks because the overlap is real even if the language differs. This is also where the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark fits. It's not magic and it's not complete for every regulation, but it gives you a baseline mapping that you can assign through policy initiatives and measure consistently. Treat it as a starting point, then add what your industry actually requires. And when auditors ask for evidence, you don't hand them dashboards. You hand them enforced intent, the management group structure, the initiatives assigned at each tier, the PM settings for privileged roles, the policy exemption register with expiry, and the logging paths that prove you can investigate. That's how audit prep drops from months to days. Because you're not assembling evidence, you're operating it continuously. Now, the last connection in this section. If you can't link governance to accountability, the system will rot. Security posture without accountability becomes security theater. Compliance without accountability becomes documentation theater. And that brings in the most ignored governance domain in Azure enterprises, cost. Because spend is not just an accounting problem, it's an authorization problem with a price tag. FinOps guardrails? Cost is governance, not accounting. Cost is not a finance problem that shows up after the architecture is done. Cost is governance. Because spend is just another way the platform expresses what was allowed to exist. If a team can deploy any SKU in any region with any redundancy setting, you didn't build a cloud platform. You built an unlimited purchasing system with an API. This is the part enterprises love to pretend is separate. Security handles security, finance handles cost, platform handles availability, and then everyone acts surprised when a breach and a budget incident are the same story. Too much permission, too few constraints, and no ownership signal. FinOps in Azure starts with the most boring truth in cloud. Visibility is not automatic. Visibility requires metadata. Metadata requires standards. Standards require enforcement. So if you want cost accountability, the first dependency is tagging. Not recommend tagging, not we have a wiki page. Enforced tagging. And you already know what enforces it. Azure policy with deny or modify. Deny when the tag is mandatory to allocate spend. Modify when you can safely inherit or append values without breaking meaning. Either way, you're not asking teams to remember. You're making the platform refuse ambiguity. The tags that matter aren't dozens of creative labels. They're a small set that lets the enterprise answer basic questions without archaeology. Who owns this? What environment is it? What product or cost center pays for it? And what data sensitivity tier it belongs to? If you can't answer those, you can't govern cost and you can't govern risk because you don't know who to call when something is exposed. Now, budgets. Most organizations deploy budgets like a personal finance app, alerts so we don't overspend. That's the wrong framing. Budgets exist to surface accountability early, while changes are still reversible. A budget alert is a governance signal. This subscription is behaving outside expectation. That might be waste. It might be a surge. It might be a migration. It might be an attacker spinning resources. The point is you find out while it's still small enough to stop. So budgets need to map to boundaries. If subscriptions are your governance containers, budgets attach to subscriptions. If your products span multiple subscriptions, you need a consistent tag model and cost analysis views to aggregate by tag. Either way, budgets without boundaries are just noise. And then there's showback and chargeback. Enterprises argue about this like it's a financial policy debate. It's not. Chargeback is enforcement. Showback is cultural pressure. Both are mechanisms that make teams feel the consequences of choices they're allowed to make. If teams can deploy anything but never see the bill, they will optimize for speed, not sustainability. That isn't malice, it's system behavior. Humans optimize for what is measured and felt. So the operating model has to make cost visible to the decision makers, not to finance after the fact. That means regular reports by owner, environment, and application. It means tying subscriptions and tags to real teams with real escalation paths. Now, the guardrails that prevent obvious damage. High-risk cost drivers are predictable. Premium SKUs, multi-region replication, unbounded data egress, and resource types that teams try out and forget. You don't solve that with education. You solve it with allowed SKUs and allowed resource types in the environments where experimentation isn't acceptable. This is the same deny versus audit philosophy from policy applied to money. In production, you deny the SKUs that can explode cost without a review. In non-production, you can allow more, but you still contain it with budgets and alerts. In sandbox, you allow the weirdness, but you cap the blast radius with tight spending limits and isolation. And here's the real point. FinOps guardrails are not about saving money. They are about enforcing intentionality. When a workload requests an expensive configuration, the platform should force a moment of decision. Is this required? Who approves it? And what is the expected outcome? If you can't answer that, the platform shouldn't allow it by default. Because otherwise you don't have cloud governance. You have cloud entropy with invoices. Now, none of this runs itself. Tag enforcement, budgets, chargeback models, SKU restrictions, exception handling, these are not features. They are operating disciplines. And that means the next piece has to exist. A governance operating model that survives org changes, survives pressure, and doesn't collapse into ticket-based permission vending. The operating model, RACI, escalation, and the end of ticket-based governance. Here's the part nobody wants to do, because it sounds like process. But without an operating model, everything you built so far becomes optional the moment the right person complains loudly enough. Azure governance isn't sustained by policies, it's sustained by decision rights. Who is allowed to decide, who is allowed to override, and who has to clean up the mess when reality disagrees. So the first artifact isn't another initiative. It's a RACI that names owners in plain language. Platform team owns the landing zone, the management group hierarchy, subscription vending, shared networking, central logging destinations, and the policy baselines that define non-negotiables. Security owns the security requirements, the risk acceptance criteria, the review of exceptions that change exposure, and the monitoring expectations that prove controls are working. Application teams own the workloads inside the boundaries, including data classification inside their apps, operational reliability, and compliance with the baseline. They do not own the baseline itself. FinOps or finance owns tagging standards for chargeback and the budget model, plus escalation when spend violates expectations. Audit and risk owns evidence requirements, the cadence of reviews, and the definition of what acceptable looks like for regulated workloads. If you can't point at an owner, you don't have governance. You have distributed blame. Now you define decision paths. This is where most enterprises break things because they default to open a ticket. Ticket-based governance is governance theater. It centralizes friction, not control. The right model is simple. 3 lanes. Self-serve lane, if it's within baseline and within budget, teams deploy without asking. That includes standard resource types, approved regions, approved SKUs, and approved network patterns. The platform team does not approve normal work. Approval lane. If it increases risk or cost meaningfully, it requires approval, not by the platform team, but by the correct owner. Cost exceptions go to FinOps, exposure exceptions go to security, architecture deviations go to the platform team if they affect shared services or boundaries. Denied lane. Some things are just not allowed. Public endpoints in production if your model forbids them, random regions for data residency reasons, broad role assignments at the tenant root. If something belongs in the denied lane, you encode it as deny, not as a policy document. And yes, this will cause deployment failures. That is not a failure of governance. That is governance functioning. Now the workflow for exceptions, because exceptions are the entropy gateway. If you don't design the workflow, teams will invent one by messaging whoever they know. The workflow is request, review, approve, expire, revalidate, remove. Request includes scope, duration, reason, and a link to a ticket. No ticket, no exception, because we need it is not traceable intent. Review includes risk classification. Is this a waiver or is it mitigated? What compensating controls exist? Who owns those controls? Approve includes explicit expiry. Even mitigations get a review date. Nothing stays forever without reapproval. Expire means the system forces the question again. If the business still needs it, they ask again and the owner reaccepts the risk. If they don't ask again, the exception dies. And that's how you prevent exception permanence. Revalidate means you periodically audit active exemptions and remove the ones that don't have a current business reason, not annually, continuously in small batches. Remove means cleanup is part of the process, not a future hope. Now make policy behave like code, because policy is code. Version your initiatives and assignments. Use pull requests. Require review from the owners who will carry the risk. Deploy in rollout rings. Dev management group first, then non-prod, then prod. That distinction matters because policy changes are production changes. Also, treat exemptions as code-adjacent artifacts. If your policy lifecycle doesn't track them, you'll end up with orphaned exceptions and mystery compliance gaps. Finally, stop making the platform team the help desk. The platform team's job is to maintain the guardrails and the paved roads, not to click approve on every deployment. If your governance model requires a ticket for normal work, teams will route around you. They'll use shadow subscriptions, alternate tenants, or unmanaged identities. The system will still run. It will just run without your control. So the operating model is the mechanism that keeps autonomy safe. Clear owners, clear lanes, controlled exceptions, and policy as code, lifecycle discipline that survives people changes. 3 enterprise scenarios, what works at scale looks like. Now apply all of that to reality, because this is where governance either proves itself or collapses into theory. Scenario 1, M&A cloud onboarding. An acquired company shows up with Azure subscriptions that were built under a different threat model, a different cost model, and usually a different level of discipline. The naive enterprise move is to treat onboarding as an assessment project. Weeks of meetings, manual reviews, spreadsheets, and we'll migrate them into our standard later. Later never arrives. The scalable move is to treat onboarding as a boundary action. Those subscriptions get placed under a dedicated management group that represents the acquisition landing area. That management group has a known policy baseline, logging destinations, region constraints, required tags, and the minimum deny policies that stop obvious damage. RBAC inheritance is applied at that management group using groups, not people, so the access model is immediately consistent. Privilege is time-bound through PIM from day one because acquired admins are the highest risk identities you will inherit. Then the platform team does not manually approve every workload. They let inheritance do the work. If the workload is compliant, it deploys. If it is not, it fails, and the failure message is the governance interface. Exceptions are allowed, but they go through the same workflow: request, expiry, and revalidation. That is how you get the 70% reduction in onboarding time. You replace bespoke reviews with deterministic guardrails and predictable inheritance. And you also get the real win: 0 manual security reviews for normal work, because you encoded the review into the control plane. Scenario 2, regulated industry rollout. Finance or healthcare doesn't fail compliance because they lack policy documents. They fail because they can't prove control consistently across hundreds of teams and thousands of resources. The working model is a regulated management group tier with non-negotiable baseline policies. Encryption isn't a recommendation. Diagnostics aren't when we get to it. Network exposure isn't a per-team preference. The baseline is assigned as an initiative, versioned and rolled out like code. Deviations are time-bound, owned, and documented as waivers or mitigations with evidence. PIM is mandatory for boundary-changing roles, and activation events are part of the audit story. Then continuous compliance becomes simple. The organization can show what is enforced, what is compliant, and what is exempted at any point in time. Audit preparation shrinks from months to days because the evidence is not assembled. It is produced by design. And over time, findings reduce because the system stops relying on human memory to enforce controls. Scenario 3, multi-team, multi-tenant governance inside a single Azure tenant. This is where most enterprises die slowly. Hundreds of application teams want autonomy. Security wants control. The platform team wants to avoid becoming a bottleneck. The default outcome is either chaos or bureaucracy. The model that survives is intentional boundary design plus self-service within Guardrails. Subscriptions are vended through a standard process, placed into management groups that reflect environment and risk, and inherit the baseline automatically. RBAC is group-based, scoped, and boring. Owner is scarce. PIM is mandatory for elevated roles. Azure policy is not guidance. It is a gate, and the operating model makes the ticket queue disappear by design. Normal work is self-serve. Risk-increasing work requires approvals from the correct owner. Forbidden work is denied by policy, not debated in meetings. Exceptions expire by default. And revalidation is routine, not heroic. And that's how you get no production outages due to over-permissioned access. And not because nobody makes mistakes, but because mistakes can't cross boundaries as easily. The blast radius is smaller. The identity surface is narrower. The policies catch the obvious failures early. And the org stops depending on tribal knowledge to keep production alive. These three scenarios look different. They are the same system, a hierarchy that encodes intent, access that assigns roles to groups and uses PIM to prevent privilege permanence, policy that enforces what is allowed to exist, signals from posture and compliance that feed back into guardrails, and an operating model that turns governance into a product, not a ticket desk. Governance is enforced intent or its entropy. Governance is not what the enterprise says it believes. It's what the control plane refuses to allow. If you do nothing else, lock down identity with group-based RBAC and PM, define management groups that reflect risk, and deploy 5 deny policies that prevent obvious damage. Subscribe for the next episode on building a landing zone operating model with policy as code, rollout rings, and exception handling that doesn't decay into conditional chaos.